Hey guys, tonight we begin with a story about children. Royal children, to be precise, and not the ones who grew up to have portraits in museums or statues in town squares or biographies that get assigned in history class. No, tonight we're looking at the ones who simply vanished. Not in a spooky horror movie way, not in a crime thriller way, but in a quiet, melancholic, where did they go sort of way. So dim the lights, settle into a comfortable position, maybe pull a blanket over your knees, and let's drift into the strangely sad world of royal offspring who disappeared from history. There's something inherently soothing, in a weird way, about imagining these children. Because even though their names might flicker in old documents, most of the details of their lives have evaporated, leaving us with just faint traces, a birth date, perhaps a mention in a royal ledger, and a quiet question mark. They were born into privilege and pomp, but they didn't always get the fairy tale ending you might expect. In fact, many didn't get any ending that anyone recorded. Let's start gently with a royal child whose story is less of a narrative and more of a ripple in time. Take, for instance, little John of Gaunt's family. Now, before you think this is a complicated math problem, John of Gaunt was an English prince in the 14th century. He was famous for being, well, aristocratic, and for having more children than most families today can count on two hands. But one of his daughters, a girl whose name appears in some records and vanishes in others, seemed to have slipped through the cracks entirely. Contemporary letters mention her as being frail but spirited, and then nothing. No marriage, no scandal, no notable illnesses. She just disappears. Now, historians can speculate. Perhaps she died young. Perhaps she entered a convent quietly, avoiding the politics and pressures of the English court. Or perhaps, in the kind of bureaucratic oversight that only a medieval household could manage, she simply wasn't deemed worth recording. And you know what? That's oddly calming. A child so completely lost to history that we only have a hint she ever existed at all. Let's float over to another royal disaster, shall we? The 15th century was rife with these little vanishings. Take Edward V of England, one of the infamous princes in the Tower. He was born in 1470, part of a dynasty that loved to be dramatic and, of course, a little dangerous. When he was only 12, Edward and his younger brother Richard were taken to the Tower of London, ostensibly for protection. And then they disappeared. Records go silent. No dramatic last words, no secret diary tucked under a mattress, no mysterious letter to a lover. Just gone. Now, Edward's father had been a king. His uncle became a king. And historians have debated ever since what happened. Some say murder. Others suggest exile. And some, the more optimistic among us, imagine that maybe they simply escaped the tower with tiny little disguises and lived quietly in the countryside, forever free from royal duties. Which, frankly, sounds like a lovely bedtime fantasy. Moving slightly north, across the Channel to France, we find the similar pattern. Consider Charles, Duke of Berry, in the late 17th century. Another royal child who disappears from popular memory, though he was documented at birth with much fanfare. His life, according to records, was tragically short. But the details are hazy, like a clouded window. Was it illness? Was it neglect? Was it some minor court scandal nobody wanted to talk about? The important thing here isn't the drama. It's the quiet, almost imperceptible erasure of a life that once held enormous promise. And there's a sort of hypnotic melancholy in imagining a corridor in Versailles where this child ran, played, and perhaps sighed at the weight of noble expectations, only to fade from the record entirely. Then there's the Spanish Habsburgs, who were especially fond of producing heirs. Philip II had a daughter, Isabella Clara, who despite surviving to adulthood had younger siblings who vanished from the pages of history almost as quickly as they were born. Infant mortality was a fact of life, of course, but there's something gentle and sad about picturing a nursery filled with tiny robes, empty cradles, and whispers of children who were named, cherished briefly, and then, quietly, forgotten. It wasn't negligence, necessarily. It was just the rhythm of life in a time when a crown demanded heirs, and the world was mercilessly practical about such things. And as we reflect on that, we can breathe slowly and remember that sometimes the most significant lives are the ones that leave the faintest traces. Now, let's meander over to Russia for a bit, of a different flavor. Ivan the Great, or Ivan IV, is often remembered for his violent tendencies and political chaos. But he also had children, many, many children, some of whom are barely mentioned in chronicles. There's a quiet note in a 16th century ledger about a daughter who was sent to a convent at age 7 for safety and piety, and then, predictably, disappears from every record afterward. No letters, no portraits, no accounts of marriage, just a child quietly absorbed into the background of a vast, sprawling empire. It's not exciting, it's not scandalous, and it's definitely not a plot twist. But it's profoundly serene to think of her days passing in gentle monotony, doing exactly what a small royal in a convent might do, maybe singing softly, sweeping floors, reading prayer books, completely removed from the turmoil of court life. Floating back west, let's glance at the Holy Roman Empire for a little. Ferdinand II had a daughter named Maria, born with high expectations, naturally, and as often happens, some of these children never grow into the roles their families dreamed up for them. Maria's records show her presence at ceremonial events, and then, rather abruptly, nothing. Scholars speculate about illness, possibly a minor epidemic, but the details are not preserved, and that absence creates a kind of calm mystery. Imagine the lull of a royal nursery, sunlight spilling over a cradle, while outside the empire buzzes with politics and plots. And inside, a child quietly drifts through her days, entirely removed from history's grand narrative. Then there's the Ottoman Empire, where sultans also had large families. Sultan Ahmed I had many children, some of whom are virtually forgotten. A daughter, whose name flickers in palace records, is recorded as present at court, and then silence. The Ottomans were meticulous with bureaucracy, so the absence of further mention is unusual. It creates a soft, ghostly presence in history. A child who existed, had a life, and then simply faded from the ledger of human memory. There is a strange comfort in this. It's quiet, almost meditative, to imagine her wandering the corridors of Versailles, listening to the clatter of servants' footsteps, and then drifting into obscurity. Moving to Scandinavia, Denmark's royal families also offer these gentle vanishings. Christian IV, a king famous for both his architectural projects and his rather ordinary hobbies like hunting, had children who disappeared without fanfare. One child, mentioned in passing in correspondence, simply disappears from the court's diary. Not scandalous, not tragic in an overt sense, just gone. Perhaps an illness, perhaps a quiet marriage into a minor noble house. The point isn't the mystery itself, but the calmness of imagining a life quietly ending or transforming without anyone making a fuss. Finally, let's drift to the more obscure edges of Europe. Consider the small principalities of Italy, the microstates where a child might be a duke one day and forgotten the next. Records are sparse. A child born to a minor ruling family might appear in a baptismal registry, have a brief mention in a letter, and then vanish entirely from history. No wars, no marriages, no alliances, just a tiny life flickering for a moment and disappearing. The rhythm of such lives is soothing to imagine. Days spent wandering gardens, listening to tutors drone on, watching candles burn in empty chapels, all perfectly ordinary, mundane, and gone.
All right. Let's drift gently from Western Europe to other corners of the world, where royal children often disappeared just as quietly, though sometimes under very different circumstances. Because if there's one universal truth, it's that royals, everywhere, have had a habit of producing children faster than anyone could keep track of. And the historical record has a tendency to let the smaller, less politically useful ones quietly vanish. Take the Ming dynasty in China, for example. The imperial court was enormous, like a small city filled with palaces, gardens, and corridors that twist endlessly. Princes and princesses were born constantly, and the bureaucrats recorded their births meticulously, until they didn't. One daughter, born to the Yongle emperor, was mentioned in a court registry with the usual flourish, banners, incense, and lots of officials nodding politely. And then, poof, nothing. No further mentions, no marriage arrangements, no hints of death. Just an absence that stretches over decades. Historians can speculate endlessly, but the comforting image here is of a tiny princess wandering a palace garden, perhaps chasing butterflies or learning calligraphy, completely unknown to the wider world, a life gently unfolding and fading away without a single dramatic plot twist. Floating slightly westward, we can glance at the Ottoman Empire again. The sultans loved to have children, and for every future sultan or sultana we remember, there were a handful who vanished into the margins. One son of the Sultan Murad III is recorded as surviving infancy, only to disappear from palace records soon after. Perhaps he died quietly of fever, perhaps he entered a convent-like life within the palace, or perhaps he was quietly sent to a relative's household to avoid overcrowding. Whatever the case, there's a strangely soothing regularity in imagining a life that exists, fulfills itself quietly, and leaves no lasting disturbance in history. No battles, no scandals, just existence. Meanwhile, in the Mughal Empire, which spanned vast parts of India and Pakistan, the emperors were equally prolific. Emperor Akbar had many children, some of whom are famous for their political and military exploits, and some who vanish like mist. One daughter, briefly mentioned in an imperial diary, seems to have disappeared after a few years. Perhaps she was married off to a distant noble family. Perhaps she died in infancy. Perhaps she simply preferred drawing and embroidery to palace intrigue. There's a soft charm in imagining her days spent quietly painting miniature landscapes, sitting under a tree, watching the sun filter through the palace latticework. History doesn't record her accomplishments, but that quiet life, ordinary, calm, and private, is somehow reassuring in its simplicity. Let's float northward again to the smaller kingdoms of Scandinavia. Norway, Sweden, and Denmark have numerous minor royals whose children were barely chronicled. In one Norwegian duchy, a daughter is noted in church records as having been baptized with great fanfare, only to vanish from court records entirely. No political marriages, no arranged alliances, no letters home. Just an absence that grows over the decades until historians shrug and move on. The gentle image of her running through the snow-dusted palace corridors, perhaps chasing a sibling, perhaps listening to the faint song of a court musician, is strangely soothing. It's the kind of calm, rhythmic imagery that lulls you into a near sleep, imagining life as a series of quiet, unremarkable days. Back in Western Europe, we can examine the French Bourbons. Louis XIV, the Sun King, had children who became the darlings of Versailles and others who disappeared quietly. One lesser-known daughter, born in a small chateau, was briefly mentioned in letters as being delicate and shy, and then simply disappears from records. Perhaps she was sent to a convent. Perhaps she succumbed to illness. The details are absent, and that absence itself has a strangely meditative quality. Imagine a soft morning, sunlight sliding through tall windows, a child's breath barely audible in a palace nursery, the world moving relentlessly on outside while she simply exists in her small, private orbit. Italy, with its patchwork of principalities, provides even more vanished children. The Medicis, the Sforzas, the Gonzagas, they all produced children who appeared in registries, had a brief presence in the court, and then vanished. A daughter of the Gonzaga family in Mantua is mentioned as promising in a ledger, only to disappear from all further documents. Perhaps she married quietly into a minor noble family. Perhaps she devoted herself to painting, music, or prayer. Whatever her path, her life unfolded away from history's spotlight. And in imagining her days, sunlight on marble floors, faint music in the background, a cat weaving between her ankles, we can settle into a calm, reflective state. It's repetitive, gentle, and rhythmically comforting. Now if we drift to the Byzantine Empire, the lost children of emperors take on a slightly different hue. The late Byzantine courts were political whirlwinds, and many children, especially daughters, were scarcely mentioned except when needed for alliances. A daughter of Emperor Manuel II is recorded as existing for a few years, but disappears from the chronicles. Perhaps she became a nun, perhaps she died of illness, perhaps she simply faded from record. Picture her in a sunlit courtyard, tracing the outlines of mosaics, hearing distant chants echo off marble walls, entirely unbothered by politics or dynastic expectations. That quiet repetition, the sun rising, the tiles warmed, the day passing gently, is exactly the kind of image that soothes, almost hypnotically. Even small principalities in Eastern Europe had lost royal children. The minor dukes of Poland, Hungary, and Bohemia produced offspring that appear briefly in church records or letters, and then vanish. A child in a Hungarian castle might be mentioned as healthy, intelligent, and with good prospects, and then simply disappears. Scholars speculate endlessly about epidemics, marriages, or convents, but the image that settles in the mind is simple. A child wandering stone corridors, listening to distant bells, feeling a soft breeze from the open windows. No battles, no betrayals, just the gentle passage of time, unnoticed by most, unrecorded by history, yet perfectly serene. And then there's the tiny kingdoms of the Balkans. These courts were small but intensely political. A child born to a local prince might appear in baptismal records, and then nothing. Sometimes they died young. Sometimes they married quietly into a neighboring family. The fascination here isn't mystery or drama. It's the sheer calm of imagining a life that unfolds entirely out of history's view. Soft mornings, quiet meals, afternoons spent in gardens or libraries, all unnoticed except for a few caretakers. That monotony, in a strange way, becomes almost meditative. And finally, we can glance at some of the lost royal children in the Middle East, particularly in Persia. The Safavid dynasty had many princes and princesses whose lives flickered briefly across court records and then disappeared. One daughter is mentioned in a diplomatic letter as having been gifted and charming, and then nothing. No marriage alliances, no court intrigues. Perhaps she became a patron of the arts quietly, or perhaps she lived entirely in private, far from political machinations. The image of her sitting in a quiet garden, reading or sketching, perhaps listening to the soft hum of servants walking past, is gentle and hypnotic. And so, across centuries and continents, we see a pattern emerge. Royal children, born into power and expectation, often vanish from history in the most ordinary, unremarkable ways. Not every life is recorded. Not every life matters in a historical sense. Some simply exist and quietly fade. And as we imagine these vanished lives, we can feel a soft relaxation settling over us, because history doesn't always need drama or scandal to be interesting. Sometimes it's enough to picture the soft, rhythmic cadence of ordinary days.
Let's drift further into the quieter corners of history, where royal children existed briefly and then slipped entirely out of view. Because, as we've seen, disappearing from history isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's gentle, almost meditative, a life that unfolds without fanfare, then quietly fades. Consider the minor German principalities of the 16th and 17th centuries. These courts were full of little dukes and duchesses who, for all intents and purposes, mattered very little beyond their own households. A child might be baptized with ceremony, attended by local dignitaries, and noted in meticulous ledgers, only to vanish shortly after. The records rarely explain why. Perhaps illness claimed them. Perhaps they were quietly married off into obscurity. Perhaps they simply lived ordinary lives outside the public eye. And here's the hypnotic part. Imagining these children wandering cold stone halls, tracing patterns in the dust, listening to the faint echo of distant court music, offers a strangely soothing rhythm, like a lullaby composed of silence and shadow. Floating to the Mediterranean, the kingdom of Naples and the small Sicilian principalities offer similar stories. A child might be born to a Spanish-inflected noble house, enjoy a few years of attention, and then disappear. Some may have died young. Others may have been quietly sent to convents or monasteries to avoid the political complications of inheritance. But the repeated pattern, birth, brief presence, disappearance, has its own calm cadence. Imagine a sun-drenched courtyard, orange blossoms spilling over the walls, and a child quietly watching pigeons flutter about the fountain, unaware of history's indifference. It's soothing to picture because it's so ordinary. The world outside moves with the clatter of politics, armies, and marriages, and yet here is a life simply existing, softly and unnoticed. We can also float northward again, to the Danish and Swedish courts of the 17th century. Christian IV, as we mentioned earlier, produced children who thrived in the public eye and others who quietly vanished from the annals. One daughter is recorded in correspondence as being gentle and obedient,
and then disappears entirely. No marriage, no notable public act, nothing. Her life may have been short, or she may have retreated into private domestic life. Picture a snowy morning, frost on the palace windows, the gentle sound of servants moving quietly, and a child sitting with a small book in hand, perfectly unaware of history's gaze. There's a soft rhythm in imagining this monotony, a kind of soothing meditation. Turning to Eastern Europe, Poland and Bohemia provide more examples. Minor dukes and princes had children who are recorded in church records and letters, then simply vanish. A child might exist for only a few years in documentation, then be forgotten entirely. In a quiet Polish castle, a young prince might wander stone corridors, perhaps drawing in a notebook, listening to the wind through latticed windows. In Bohemia, a daughter might sit in a sunlit garden, brushing leaves from her skirts, entirely unbothered by political intrigues. The repetition of these small, unremarkable lives creates a calming pattern, like gentle waves lapping against the shore. Meanwhile, in the distant reaches of Asia, some minor Japanese imperial children were born to branch families and then disappear. Records are sparse. A child might be noted as present at a seasonal court ceremony and then never mentioned again. Perhaps illness claimed them. Perhaps they became monks or nuns quietly, removed from the political narrative. Imagine a quiet morning in Heian-era Kyoto, cherry blossoms drifting slowly through a garden, a child walking barefoot on soft earth, breathing in the scent of incense, completely unobserved by history. That image alone is enough to bring a soft, drowsy calm, because it's repetitive, gentle, and utterly removed from drama. Back in the Mediterranean, the Kingdom of Portugal had its share of lost royal children. Some were recorded with excitement, their births celebrated with fanfare, only to vanish from court records after a few years. Perhaps illness took them quietly. Perhaps a convent claimed them. Perhaps they were married off into minor houses without ceremony. The soothing thought here is imagining a child walking slowly through palace gardens, sunlight glinting off fountains, petals falling quietly, and life continuing unremarkably outside the notice of historians. In France, aside from the famous Bourbons, there were also minor noble families whose children disappeared almost immediately after birth. A daughter might be mentioned briefly in letters or in baptismal records, and then never again. Scholars often shrug at these vanishings, but for us there is a strange calm in picturing her life. Afternoons spent drawing, tracing patterns in the sunlight, listening to servants moving quietly, and drifting through her days without the weight of dynastic expectations. Repetition is key here. The gentle rhythm of ordinary existence, unrecorded, unnoticed, and serene. The Byzantine Empire also provides examples of quiet disappearance. Lesser-known imperial children were recorded at birth and then vanish without explanation. A daughter of a minor emperor might spend her days wandering marble corridors, tracing mosaics, listening to faint chants from a distant chapel, and then fade entirely from records. There is nothing dramatic about this, nothing tragic in the sensational sense, only the hypnotic calm of monotony and gentle repetition. Meanwhile, in Persia under the Safavid dynasty, the same pattern emerges. A daughter or son might be recorded in court letters, noted for a few minor achievements, and then disappear. Perhaps illness claimed them. Perhaps marriage sent them quietly to another household. Perhaps they retreated into private life. The soothing image is constant. Quiet gardens, soft sunlight, corridors echoing with the gentle sound of footsteps, and a life existing without fanfare. The pattern repeats, calming us by its predictability and gentle rhythm. Even in minor Italian principalities, Mantua, Ferrara, Parma, royal children appear briefly in baptismal records or court correspondence and then vanish. Some lived long lives entirely removed from public attention. Others likely died in infancy. The point is that their stories, or lack thereof, create a hypnotic cadence. A child in a sunlit room tracing patterns in the dust, listening to the faint sound of music or birds, slowly moving through life unobserved, unrecorded, and serene. And so, across continents and centuries, a pattern is clear. Royal children, born into privilege, often vanished quietly from historical records. Some died young, some were married off quietly into obscurity, some chose or were forced into private religious life. And in all these vanishings, there is a calm, hypnotic rhythm. Life unfolds, repeats, and fades without drama or spectacle. The details may be sparse, but the rhythm of their quiet days can lull us into gentle reflection, like a soft, slow river meandering through time. It's comforting, in a strange way, to picture these children walking quietly through palace corridors, sitting in gardens, tracing mosaics, sketching or reading, listening to soft music, feeling sunlight on their faces, and existing in a rhythm entirely unnoticed by history. There is no excitement, no scandal, no heroic feats, just existence. And that repetition, that calm persistence of ordinary life, is hypnotically relaxing.
Let's drift back to Europe for a moment, because even centuries after the well-known royal families, minor dynasties produced children whose lives flickered briefly and then disappeared. Take the small duchies in Germany, for instance. They were like little kingdoms in miniature, full of tapestries, small armies, and slightly confusing hierarchies. A child might be baptized with pomp, a few nobles nodding politely, and then vanish from records entirely. No drama, no intrigue, no scandal, just quiet existence. Perhaps they grew up learning music, perhaps walking corridors lined with polished wood and stone floors, perhaps spending afternoons watching birds flutter in palace gardens. The repetition of these quiet moments day after day has a hypnotic calm. In Spain, aside from the famously documented Habsburg and Bourbon children, minor noble households produced their own lost children. One daughter might appear briefly in correspondence, praised for her intelligence and composure, and then disappear from all further records. Perhaps she was married into a minor family in a neighboring town. Perhaps she became a nun. Perhaps illness claimed her. Imagine her days passing in quiet rhythm, sunlight on tiled floors, gentle drafts through latticed windows, afternoons spent tracing patterns in embroidery. That repetition, that gentle calmness, is precisely what makes imagining these lives so soothing. In Portugal, aside from the famously documented Habsburg and Bourbon children, minor royal families also had lost children. One daughter might appear briefly in court records as healthy, cheerful, promising, and then vanish entirely. Scholars speculate about disease, early death, or minor marriages. Picture him wandering a quiet courtyard, observing the soft movement of fountains, the shadows cast by ornate arches, his life passing in slow, calm repetition. There's no urgency, no drama, just gentle days flowing seamlessly into one another, each one quiet and predictable. Meanwhile, minor principalities in Italy
continue to produce children who vanish from history. A daughter of the Sforza family might appear in letters as delicate and sweet, and then disappear completely. Perhaps she became a minor patron of the arts, perhaps a nun, or perhaps she simply lived quietly in the palace. Imagine her walking along sunny gardens, listening to soft music echoing off the walls, drawing patterns in dust, watching petals fall. That repetition, that gentle rhythm, is perfect for drifting toward sleep. Even in the Nordic countries, beyond the better-known royal families, lost children abound. A son or daughter in Denmark or Norway might be recorded briefly in a baptismal registry and then vanish entirely. Perhaps they were sent to a minor estate. Perhaps they entered religious life. Perhaps illness claimed them. Picture a quiet winter morning, frost on the windows, a child moving softly through stone corridors, footsteps echoing faintly, days repeating in gentle monotony. That repetitive calm, the slow unfolding of ordinary life, is hypnotic. Back in France, aside from the famous Bourbons, minor noble families produced children who exist in records for only a few years. One child might be mentioned in a letter as observant and clever, and then disappear completely. Imagine a quiet room, sunlight shifting across polished wood floors, a child tracing patterns with a pencil, listening to faint music, days blending softly together without interruption. That gentle, unremarkable repetition is exactly the rhythm that lulls the mind into drowsiness. The Holy Roman Empire is another rich source of lost children. Countless minor dukes and princes had children who appear briefly in baptismal records, letters, or ceremonial lists, and then vanish. Some died young, some married quietly into distant houses, some retreated into private life. Imagine a quiet courtyard, stone arches glowing in the afternoon light, a child walking slowly, listening to faint clatter of servants, days passing gently, almost imperceptibly. That calm monotony is soothing, like a soft wave lapping at the shore. Meanwhile, in Asia, minor royal children in Japan, China, and Korea often disappear from records. A child might be noted as attending a seasonal court event and then never mentioned again. Perhaps they entered a temple. Perhaps illness claimed them. Perhaps they married quietly into a minor noble family. Picture cherry blossoms falling slowly around a small figure in a palace garden, wind rustling gently through the trees, a life passing quietly, entirely unobserved by history. That repetition and gentle rhythm are hypnotic. In Persia, again, minor Safavid children appear briefly in letters or court records and then vanish. Perhaps they became scholars, perhaps they entered private life, perhaps illness claimed them. Imagine sunlight filtering through latticed windows, shadows playing on soft stone floors, a child drawing patterns in dust, moving through life in slow, calm repetition. That rhythm, so gentle and predictable, is perfect for drifting into a meditative state. Even minor German and Italian principalities continued to produce children who appear in records, then disappear. Some die young, some retreat into convents or minor households, some live quietly outside the public eye. Picture corridors lined with tapestries, sunlight glinting off polished floors, a child walking slowly, drawing patterns in dust, life passing gently. The soft, repetitive rhythm, devoid of drama or excitement, is hypnotic. Back in the Ottoman Empire, beyond the Sultan's better-known children, dozens more vanish quietly. One son or daughter might appear briefly in palace letters or ledgers and then disappear entirely. Perhaps illness claimed them, perhaps they were quietly married off, perhaps they became scholars or entered religious life. Imagine a quiet chamber, sunlight falling through latticed windows, a child tracing patterns in dust, listening to distant footsteps, days repeating gently. That calm monotony is deeply soothing. Across the world, a pattern emerges again and again. Royal children, born into privilege and expectation, vanish from records quietly. Some die young, some marry quietly, some retreat into religious life or minor households. Others simply fade into private existence. There is no excitement, no scandal, no dramatic plot twists, just life repeated gently and then quietly erased from history. As we drift further along this pattern, it becomes clear that these vanished children offer a soft, hypnotic rhythm. Corridors, gardens, sunlit rooms, faint music, the rustle of silk, the faint echo of footsteps, all repeated across continents and centuries. That repetition, the slow, gentle cadence of ordinary life, is perfectly suited for drifting toward sleep. Imagine all these lost children together across Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. They exist briefly, quietly, and then vanish. Their lives are repetitive, gentle, and entirely unobserved by history. The rhythm of their days, walking through gardens, tracing patterns, listening to faint sounds, observing the sunlight, creates a soft, hypnotic cadence. And as we let these images settle in our minds, our breathing slows, our eyelids grow heavy, and a sense of drowsy calm washes over us.